In their reInvent conference, Amazon announced a new open source software that allows people who are logged into the proprietary Transact SQL to SQL Server Microsoft specific dialect to move easily to Postgres without changing their code. That's a big claim. How about we jump into it and discuss whether this is really gonna kill SQL Server and move people from SQL Server to Postgres easily? I personally don't think so. How about we jump into it and discuss that? So guys, if you're new here, my name is Hussein and I discuss backend engineering and software news like this one. So if you like this content, subscribe, hit the like button, and let's just jump into it. So let's go ahead and define what Babelfish is according to this article. Again, this is very, very early news, so we barely have any data or anything really to go on, right? There are so many unanswered questions, as usual, and there are some doubts, and there's some excitement. I am excited about this. I like this. It's a very innovative technology. But I have my doubts, and I personally do not think it will succeed. But that's just my opinion. Let's discuss this. Let's read part of the article and then jump into analysis portion. So, Matt Isay, I think that's how you pronounce their name. Matt Isay wrote this article, says, okay, want more Postgres? You just might like Babelfish. So the greatest force in legacy databases is inertia. When I read this, it is so true. It is the stickiest thing. Databases are the stickiest thing in the application. Once you are stuck to a database, you cannot move easily. And everybody in the industry knows that. It's just migration from one database to another database is hardly worth the effort and the money and the cost. Right? No matter, unless the database that you move on is 100 or 200 times better, right? Otherwise, the move doesn't matter. So that's why it says inertia. So there's this inertia that comes with the database, and it is so strong, and you cannot easily move. So this is true if there are compelling reasons to migrate. You might be happy running SQL Server, for example, but won't Postgres benefit, such as transparent security. I mean, SQL Server has the security. Or handling the specific data types, such as spatial or geographical objects. I believe SQL Server also has spatial types. Or you'd like to save money currently spent on, yeah, that's a real reason, Amazon. Just jump to the chase. You want people to move from Microsoft to open source so they can, because you cannot move them to your proprietary database. You just want to move them out of Microsoft. So that's the real reason. Let's just be honest about this, right? So we want to move them. And that's exactly what Google did to Amazon with Kubernetes. Kubernetes is an overhyped, over-engineered solution for 99% of everybody, right? But what Google says, okay, AWS is just taking over the cloud, right? So how do we kill this momentum? Everybody's on AWS. When the cloud happened, Amazon jammed into it. Google had almost no shares. Microsoft had almost no share on the cloud. So it's like, let's bring our Borg, I think it's called Borg architecture, as an open source Kubernetes. So say, hey, you guys are locked on to Amazon. No, you don't want to be locked on to Amazon. Here's a software that you can just build on top of, and then you can shift and lift and lift and shift and dance over any other cloud. That's what they will sell. So they built Kubernetes so that's the selling point. Just you don't want to be locked on to Amazon. So we don't really care. Google doesn't care if the customers didn't come to them. They just want people away from Amazon. You want people to shift away from Amazon. That's the same weapon that Amazon is using. So Google did it to Amazon through Kubernetes, and now Amazon is doing it to Microsoft through Babelfish, just to attack certain things. That's just my opinion. Again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it's clear as day what's going on here. All right, whatever reason you want to migrate to Postgres, they just go here. It's like, what is the reasons to migrate? Of course, Postgres is a great database. SQL Server is a great database, right? I use both of them on daily basis, alongside Oracle and HANA. Not much HANA, but most of these thread databases, I interact with them on a daily basis. So they go on here and say, okay, Postgres is great, and you want to migrate, but here's what we want. I want to read about Babelfish itself. So let's read about the actual Babelfish. What is Babelfish? The thing they just announced. Today we announce plans to open source Babelfish for Postgres, a SQL Server compatible endpoint for Postgres to make PostgreSQL fluent in understanding. So this is as vague as it can be, right? We have no idea what endpoint really means. Is that its own software that I have to spin up and listen to a specific port, and my app need to just connect to this endpoint, which in turn will connect to Postgres? Is that it? Is that? Or is it a Postgres extension that sits on top of Postgres and handle that translation? We have no idea. There's absolutely no documentation of this. So we have to wait until 2021 when we see the code to actually understand what that means. All right, let's continue. To make Postgres fluent in understanding communication from apps written to SQL Server, including understanding t-sql and TDS communication protocol. This isn't the first effort to facilitate migration from SQL Server to Postgres, of course. In Ian Harding, for example, helping people for 20 years to move from migration from the, so we have ETL tools, we have all kind of tools to move from one database to another database. People have been doing it all the time. It's hard, right? However, we believe Babelfish stand out because it is not another migration service. So it is a migration service, but not just another migration service. As useful as those can be, Babelfish enables Postgres to understand database requests, both the command and the protocol. Interesting. From applications written for Microsoft SQL Server without changing library. That's a big thing. If I don't need to touch my library and put a Postgres driver there, or I don't have to change the database schema, or I don't have to change my SQL statements. Wow, that's a big thing. This means much faster migrations with minimum developer efforts. It is also centered on correctness, meaning application designed to use SQL Server functionality will behave the same on Postgres as they would on SQL Server. Really? How would you guarantee that? I have no idea how. Behave, what does that mean? Behave the same. Do you mean correctness? It better be correctness, right? It's like they give a nice example here with the money data type. There is a money data type in SQL Server, and there is a money data type in Postgres. So they figure out the nuance of how Postgres stores that versus how SQL Server stores that, and how the application read it versus like how many floating points and all that stuff. So they figure that out. That's correctness. That's very important. Here's another example. Let's read that. Example. Imagine a customer application built against SQL Server that processes and stores monetary values, such as an ERP system. A commonly used data type to store monetary values is the money data type. Money. In SQL Server, the money data type behavior is fixed using 4 digits to the right of the decimal, right? So it's like they give a number 12.8123 for people listening on the podcast. However, in Postgres, the money data type is fixed using 2 digits to the right of the decimal. So when the application tries to store the value 12.8123, for example, Postgres rounded to 12.81, which is disastrous. You just lost, what, 23 thousandths of a cent. That's just a lot of money. This seemingly subtle difference in rounding behavior could have significant impact on downstream processes, such as financial reporting. To ensure correctness in Babelfish, we need to ensure such differences, small or large, are handled with absolute fidelity. So can you imagine the code that is written for Babelfish to handle these nitty-gritty details, right? That's not easy. That's a big app. That's gonna be a huge software. So they are releasing it as open source. So let's guys, let's switch to my ugly face here. Switching to my ugly face because we don't need the article anymore. So let's discuss, guys. There are few points that I want to raise, and you're gonna start seeing it hopefully here if I can get editing right. That I think Babelfish will not be enticing enough for customers to move to this thing so they can essentially switch databases underneath. Let me explain. The first question is, will Babelfish actually include everything, absolutely everything that SQL Server could do, right? An example, store procedures, right? What if I wrote a store procedure that is baked into my SQL Server database and my application actually calls the store procedure by name? I'm just calling it, hey, execute this store procedure. That's called test. What will happen? Will Postgres actually translate that SQL Server procedure during migration? Because that's not an in-transit query. That's just a string in this case with parameters, obviously. Obviously, the parameters will have a data type, and I'm going to assume that Babelfish will take care of changing those parameters so it suits Postgres. So that's one thing. We'll include that. Another thing, authentication. SQL Server, a lot of customers, other enterprise uses Active Directory, which is Microsoft LDAP thing, right? So to sign in and actually access the database. Does Postgres support that? I think it does, but how would Babelfish fit into this equation with Active Directory? We're not sure if it includes everything, and they don't claim that it's going to include everything. I think it's gonna be a process. It's gonna be a slow process to actually capture all of that stuff, right? So that's one thing. So we're not sure what it will include. So will that be enticing enough for people to actually rely on Babelfish to move from SQL Server to Postgres? That's one thing. Another thing, it's an extra layer, right? It has to be a software. It's an open source software, so it has to run. So it takes resources. And not only that, now you're maintaining an extra layer on top of your application, and on top of your database, you have a middle layer. And we know what happened with middle layers, right? First of all, latency, right? Because now you're going through this middle layer, so that takes finite amount of time, but it will slow things down, right? It will take some time. The second thing is bugs. Like you, all of a sudden now, if something is no longer working correctly, you have, instead of looking at two factors, which is the app and the DB, right? I'm assuming you don't have any cache here because that will be another disaster. You have to look at the middle layer as well, right? And we just saw what Babelfish is supposed to do. Will that be bug-free? Absolutely not. And those bugs will be absolutely disasters. So sounds to me that is very, very risky, right? To add another layer and worry about the bugs just so I can migrate to Postgres. So yeah, it might be a little bit easier than, I still don't know. Is it really easier than just rewrite the whole app so that it talks to Postgres natively? I have no idea. It could be yes, could be no. But I'm just like discussing this and trying to take a pragmatic approach and just playing the devil's advocate here. I don't have anything against Amazon or Microsoft or SQL Server. I just like to play the two-party here. What is Babel? That's the third point. What is Babel? Is it really an endpoint? Or is it a Postgres extension? Or is it an ODBC driver? We do not know that. Where does it live? Does it live in my app as a library? They did not mention that. I'm assuming no. Is it a proxy where everything just shoots this low level layer 4 packets to a proxy which does the translation? I doubt it. It has to be a layer 7, so it looks at the data, so it has to decrypt in this case. Is it its own thing that running and listening on certain port, that is the SQL Server port, whatever that is? Forgot what is this, 1532, I think. So is that listening on that port, and then you just change the host so it points to that new host that is running Babel, and that Babel will turn around, does its thing, and then communicate with the backend. That's how Vitess work, I believe. Vitess essentially inserts itself in the middle. Or is it all the way in the backend? Is it a Postgres extension that that runs on Postgres or consumes Postgres resources and looks at every query that comes to Postgres and does the work. So many questions. We don't know what Babel is. And based on that, it really depends on the performance, which is the next point. The fourth point is performance. You might have not changed the application code as the Babelfish claims, right? I'm not going to change anything. I'm not going to change the code. I'm not going to change anything. But that SQL statement that used to execute in a certain way based on the execution planner of SQLServer might flip completely in Postgres, because Postgres will make different decision. The execution planner in Postgres will make completely different planners in Postgres compared to SQLServer. So a query that looks identical in SQLServer, well, not really, because they are translating to SQL to PostgreSQL, might look identical, but performs actually worse in Postgres. And if the application author wrote that application in a way such that it takes advantage or rely on certain, let's say, feature or implicit feature in SQLServer that performs better when the query is executing in this way, Postgres might not have that. What will happen? All of a sudden, your queries are slower. What happened here? Is Babel the reason? Is Postgres the reason? Again, come back to point 2, which is the bugs, the extra layer, extra resources, extra work. Another thing I'm not sure about, but some SQLs can be annotated with hints, which says, okay, I know this is, you might choose a full table scan over an index scan for certain cases, but I know what I'm doing. Please do an index scan for this case. There is a hints. This Oracle does that all the time. We can infer hints to SQLServer or the database, so it can switch the execution plan based on the user's request. Not generally a good idea, but when you do that, what will happen? Will Postgres understand? Will Babel understand these hints? I have no idea. Eventually, these performance problems might cause you to actually update the application code anyway, and God knows what will happen here. How would you write t-sql code anymore, right? So you have to kind of, you will be very limited with that in this case. So you're better off, in my opinion, just rewrite the whole thing to talk directly to Postgres. And the final point I want to raise is latency, right? Latency is very, very critical. And now we still don't know what Babel is because they don't tell us, but if Babel is an actually standalone process that runs and listens to a particular port, it's a server essentially, and my app connects to this server instead of SQLServer, and that endpoint talks on behalf of me to the backend, I have so many questions. If that's the architecture, will encryption be end-to-end in this case? Will I have an encryption? If I establish encryption between my client and the SQLServer, right? Will the encryption carry over here in this case where I have encryption between me and the endpoint of Babel? Obviously, they have to decrypt the traffic because it's going to be a layer 7 endpoint where it looks at the content, understands the SQL, and then parses it so it talks to the backend on SQLServer, on the Postgres on the backend, right? So will that translate to a Postgres TLS connection on the backend, right? So that's the first thing. If yes, that's good because we need encryption almost end to end. It's not really end to end; it's terminated, but at least people sniffing in the middle cannot actually tell what's going on. The second thing is latency. Now you just added an extra hop. You just added latency. So queries, right? Queries that executes will take additional hit because you're having additional hop. So that's an additional network hop. That's just the networking aspect. And we're not mentioning what the endpoint actually does, which adds extra latency of this translation of t-sql to actually PostgreSQL. That's a lot of work as well, right? Another thing with latency is like what will happen for cursors, server-side cursors. If I now establish a TCP connection with my SQLServer and I say, okay, create a cursor, and then that cursor will execute, but will not actually fetch the results. So my app will say fetch, all right? So How that translate to Postgres? Both of them has cursors, but handling stateful cursors in the app are extremely difficult. How would that work? And how is the effect on latency will be in this case? Will it be a one TCP connection? I doubt it. It's going to be different TCP connections. So almost it's going to be interesting. Is Babel's going to play as a layer 4 proxy in this case? Or is it just going to be at the Postgres? So there's a lot of unanswered questions. So I'm still digesting this. But guys, I'm going to leave the question back to you. What do you think about Babel as a technology? Do you think it's going to be taking over really the SQL Server market share and shifting it to Postgres so that Amazon will free, because Amazon now have plans to host Postgres, people will be enticed, especially people who are on top of Amazon and using SQL Server. They will be very enticed to use this technology to switch Postgres to save cost, right? Because SQL Server is costly, right? Yeah, they have to still to pay on AWS, but way easier to switch SQL Server with this technology. But I'm not sure that it will succeed with all these questions and doubts that I have. Let me know. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section below. I'm going to see you in the next one. You guys stay awesome. Goodbye.